We have the pleasure of listening to Dr. Kim Risedorph come and present and talk a little bit about End-of-Life Doulas, their caregiving, and also how we can be part of this as well. I know we'll talk more about this, but one of the things that I want to note is she is a retired United Methodist pastor who served in Pleasanton, Livermore, and Alamo. And in all of these congregations, she also started Stephen Ministries. So for our Stephen ministers who are here and those who rely on it, she shares a sentiment that I often share too, is it'd be really hard to be in a church if you didn't have Stephen ministers. Our Stephen ministers, as you know, you all provide so much care in our community. And so it's neat to share that too with you, Reverend Kim. So very thankful we're here together. And also to know her first career was college history professor with a PhD in modern Chinese history, and gave her the opportunity to travel and live in Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. So I know we're going to be very gifted today, and she's going to talk more about end-of-life doulas and the holistic approach that they offer to our community. So welcome.
So today we're going to talk about death and dying, one of our favorite topics in this culture. And we'll look a little bit at what we bring to the topic, our experiences, our beliefs, our early teachings. We'll refer a little bit to our cultural aversion to talking or thinking about death. And then I'll share some approaches that a Stephen minister or a family member or a neighbor can take. And finally, more about what it means to be an end-of-life doula and what we offer and how you can to learn more. So that's a lot. And we started with a prayer, and I'm going to add to that as we layer those prayers and move into this time together. I'm just going to read excerpts from a hymn I grew up with. I had a Sunday school teacher in our Sunday school class. The whole Sunday school was like 5 people. But she had us memorize a line from a hymn every week. So if you bump into me in the middle of the night, a hymn is going to probably pop out. So I'm forever grateful for Mrs. Claire Mason for giving me that. But I invite you to find a place to be comfortable. And I'm just going to read a line from the same, it all comes from the same hymn, different stanza from that. And we'll just let that sink on our hearts and ears as we enter this time together. Give me, O Lord, an understanding heart, that I may learn to know myself in you. Give me, O Lord, a meek and contrite heart, that I may learn to quell all selfish pride. Give me, O Lord, a gentle, loving heart, that I may learn to be more tender, kind. And with your healing, touch each wound and smart with Christly bands of truth and love to bind. May it be so. Amen. So just crowdsourcing this first question. How many of you are not going to die? Would you just raise your hand? So I want you to turn to someone near you. Make sure everyone gets covered, even if you have to pivot to the person next to you. And say out loud, and let that person say out loud, someday I'm going to die. So what came up when you said that? How was that to say that out loud? Reality. Any other emotions? Excitement. Hadn't heard that one.
It helped looking into someone else's eyes.
Ooh.
Saying it alone when you're home by yourself is a little scary.
It is a little scary. Yes. Yeah, and thank you for adding that to the mix. It's better to be in community as we explore this topic. So now what I want you to spend a few minutes doing is, it might work to just do 2 or 3 per table so the hearing is good, but 2 is ideal, 3 can work. I would like you to take note of your earliest experiences, learnings, teachings about death or dying. from your family, your friends, your faith community, novels, movies, art. Obviously, there's no right or wrong on this, but it's just kind of doing a bit of a deep dive. What do we bring to this topic? Sometimes things we're not even aware of that are deep in our DNA or whatever that is, deep in our memories. Let's go with that. Of some of the earliest teachings, experiences, images of death and dying. So I think that's clear. Take about 5 minutes to turn to one person, and if someone's not included, make sure there's a threesome that pops up. And that's a conversation you might want to pick up with your partner again if you didn't get a chance to completely cover it. I think this type of question has what I call a bit of a trickle-out effect. Once you start thinking about it, other things will come to mind. And just hold that tenderly with curiosity of all these things we have learned from our culture, art, family, faith. Lent is a perfect time to kind of do a deep dive into some of that, because the truth is that our Creator God has already planned our resurrection. And we are all going to make that transition from this life to the next. But we don't like to talk about it. Even when loved ones are dying. I've been tracking all the times that this topic comes up in the New York Times just in the last year. I'm just going to give you some excerpts. There was a guest essay by Sarah Wildman. She's a New York Times staff writer, but when her 16-year-old daughter died, she wrote eventually an opinion piece called, "If My Dying Daughter Could Face Her Mortality, Why Couldn't the Rest of Us?" It's not the easiest read, but it's written with a lot of tender compassion. One of the things she says is Americans, really Westerners, are terrified of death. We shy away from it. Death is a problem to solve, not the inevitable part of life. And there was one other thing that when her daughter was in pediatric cancer care, the emphasis was on a cure. And she was driving when the daughter, Ori, had been in care and new experiments and new drugs, and that just kept continuing. And the mom was driving when a hospice intake nurse called and told her, and the mom told her, "Oh, no, we don't need hospice. We're just about to try a new drug, an experimental drug." And the nurse acknowledged all that was true, but she added, "You know, they told me she has 6 months to live, right?" "No," I said, "you're the first to tell me." And that just made my heart kind of capsize a little, that's the way the mom heard about this. And so she talked to the oncologist who was part of their care team, and I told her the story, the nurse, the car, the prognosis, and asked, "Is it true? Does she have 6 months?" The doctor didn't quite answer. "That's an antiquated way of thinking about hospice," she said. She did not say, "Sarah, we cannot predict when death will occur, but we have discussed that there is no cure. Orly will not survive." Nor did she say, "The idea of hospice may inspire panic, but studies show it can actually extend life." So she goes on in the article. My heart ached for how that evolved for her. Orly did die, and they're, of course, processing their grief. I don't think grief is something we get over. It's something we learn to hold. And in the medical profession, death is often seen as a failure. And so there's one more trip to the ER, one more trip to the hospital that is exhausting for families, for care receivers, and hospice and palliative care. I'm also, full disclosure, a volunteer with hospice. So here's an interesting fact about hospice, not in my notes, but I think I can share it with this group. We were looking at stats about when people participate in hospice, and Anglos are usually the last group to move into that, usually within hours or days. And so they don't have the full impact of all the realms of care, medical equipment, friendly visits, pet visits, if they're trained people to bring pets to visit, and the social worker and the medical team and the medicine that all can be a part of it. And they just added a new program, I have to brag on hospice. It's called Pet Companions. So if someone in service at hospice has a beloved pet, we don't want that pet. We want that pet to be with their person right up until the end, but often there aren't plans for that pet. And so now hospice has trained people that reassure the person who is dying that that pet will be taken care of. And they foster that pet through the pet's grief, because of course the pet is grieving, will grieve, and then they find a new home. I love that. But anyways, back to our, yes.
Hospice of the East Bay.
Yes, thank you for adding that. There are a number of hospices around. This is Hospice of the East Bay. Thank you. So today we're going to explore this. What would it look like to accept that we're all going to die? And what does that practice ask of us? The truth is, the more we acclimate to, yes, part of the eternity of our life includes leaving this body. We don't know exactly what comes after, but we will all leave this body, this shell. And when we are able to say that, it turns out we live life more fully. We cherish life more fully. There's a direct ratio towards tiptoeing, towards, oh yes, this will be my experience as well. And then the index goes up in terms of a reverence for this day, for this moment, for this loved one that we have. My premise is that death is not a medical event, even though we treat it as such. It's a human experience. And Stephen ministers are so helpful to their care receivers if they're willing to openly talk about death when the care receiver initiates that conversation. And it has that wonderful side effect of when we accept our inevitable death, we're more in this moment. We're more loving. We know that this is the day and moment and relationship and pet or whatever it is that we have before us. So one of the things that allows us to do that, whether a Stephen minister or a neighbor or a family member, is what I call full self-listening. It's something that's covered a lot in doula training, and we'll get to what doula training is in a minute. But this full self-listening starts with what we just did in small groups. It's knowing what we bring to it. We are at our best in being caring, compassionate people, good Samaritans, good Presbyterians, when we know what's coursing through us. It could be we're remembering that we didn't like breakfast this morning, or we need more coffee. All those little things, if we take note of those before we walk into a situation, we are more present. And sometimes they're bigger things, that we're anxious, we want to do a good job, that the drive there, the commute there was a little bit harrowing. That's what full self-listening starts with. It's kind of doing a fearless internal inventory of what we're bringing to the moment. And then full self-listening looks at the surroundings, whether it's we're meeting someone in a facility or a home. As a Stephen minister, you're going to meet one-on-one somewhere, not in a public situation, but you're also noticing about them, yes. We're going to try some scenarios now. What if and this is just going to be like a bit of a call and response. I'm going to say something and you're going to brainstorm with me about how you might respond. A care receiver or a loved one says, I think I'm ready to die. How might you respond with your full self-listening?
Tell me about that.
Tell me about that.
You're ready to die.
You're ready to die.
I'm listening.
I'm listening. Oh, what a good crew of Stephen ministers. I'm afraid to die.
Tell me more.
Tell me more. That's always a go-to. Yeah, and if my full body listening is there, I'm not in a hurry. I'm not dreading it. I'm just saying, tell me more.
I might ask what just changed.
Especially if you have a relationship and you know something about this person. This is another training tool for end-of-life doulas and for Stephen ministers as well. It's called WAIT. Why am I talking? If you're a care receiver, oh gosh, it's a practice. It's an ongoing practice, because our tendency is to want to jump in and make our care receiver feel better. And silence is a wonderful thing. It's a respectful thing. It's a way to tenderly care for the one that we see in pain or need or suffering. True story of one of my experiences as an end-of-life doula. I was visiting with a gentleman, and he was agitated that morning. So the original plan of conversation, that wasn't what we were going to do. And he asked to go outside. It was one of those days in between the rain, and to sit in the sunshine, and he could feel the sunshine on him. So we just sat there, and I could feel all my, oh my gosh, I'm not doing this right. I don't know what to say. That nudge of inadequacy as I wanting to help him. Full self-listening, noticing that. Sometimes I just kind of go, okay, I feel that. I'm with you, Kim, and God is here too. I don't say all this out loud, but I'm going through this in my mind. Why am I talking? It was like 10 minutes of silence out there in the sun. And then I said, what's most important right now? And again, because he was nearing the time that he would pass, sometimes talking was an effort. And so was the listening. Why am I talking? Full self-listening. I just go back through those, cycle through those. And he said to me, is there anyone standing behind me? I said, no, no one behind you. And then he said, is there anyone over here to the side? No. I said, is it a kind presence that you're sensing? Because sometimes with the meds and everything, people feel you don't want them to have the hallucinations that are scary at the end of life. Sometimes there's one person where there were kind of snakes coming down out of the sea. You don't want that for anyone. That's something to reconnect with the hospice care team or the medical team and get that taken care of. So I wanted to be sure it was a kind presence. And he said it was. And I said, well, let's listen to that presence for a while. Another 10 minutes. Why am I talking? Full self-listening. Thank you, God. I just went through my regular thing. And then he said, can you gather the family? He had a blended family. And there was a lot going on in that blended family. You could talk about full self-listening. You could almost hear sometimes the tension crackle as you walked into the house. Full self-listening. Invited the family out. And one by one, very slowly for the next half hour, 45 minutes, he talked to each person. He started with me, wanted to thank me for something. But what he told his wife and his daughter was a conversation they had never had. Even now, I was crying there. Everyone was crying there. And for his daughter, who was 50 years old, she never knew she was so loved. It was transformative to her. These are the moments where we want to honor something holy that goes on when we can sit without, yes, we might feel the anxiety and the inadequacy and wondering if we're doing it right, but if we stay with, why am I talking? I can do this, I can talk, I can keep talking now, but in those situations. And then full self-listening, noticing what's percolating for the person and me and everyone. You might pick up on something else. It's what we call rugs as a end-of-life doula. Regrets, unfinished business, guilt, or shame. And you might pick up on that as you listen. If a story comes up again and again about a past event, that might be a tender clue for us to say, tell me, again, as someone said, tell me more. Or does that memory weigh on you? we can gently kind of notice their facial expression and their tone of voice. Very common near the end of life to want to look at regrets, unfinished business, guilt, and shame. And that might be something you're aware of. It might be something, yeah.
What's the difference between guilt and shame?
We had that discussion too. I think guilt is that my working definition relies a little more on Brene Brown than my own, thinking this through. But guilt is that feeling, oh, I did something wrong. Shame is, I'm wrong. That situation was bad. Shame is, I'm bad. Big difference. Big difference. One of the other things I can often say, is there anything you want to do about that? And that might be more appropriate sometimes for an end-of-life doula than a Stephen minister, but it should be in your toolbox as well. So the New York Times, this was January 19th, front page article. Gilgamesh, Sunday New York Times, so front page article. Gilgamesh, Pansy, and Quest to Live Forever. This thing we have going that people will pay oodles of money to prolong their youth or their life. Well, yeah, that might be true for your care receiver or yourself as well. And one of the discussions can be to wonder that out loud about your, certainly for your internal full self-listening, but also the things we do to stay looking, just be curious, the things we do to stay looking young, to look young. It's a whole industry. And maybe it needs to be gently challenged. Also in the New York Times, my subscription is paying off. This was February 16th of this year. There was Lessons from Living Well from the Dying. It was just a little blurb from a hospice nurse about advice to apply to our life for those at the end of their lives and for us at this part of our lives. The bold sections are find joy in the ordinary. An alternative to dreading or distancing or worrying about getting older or our own death. Instead of telling myself I have to go to the gym, I'll say I get to go to the gym. Just little ways to do that Lenten practice. Don't fret over the small stuff. Boy, that's an ongoing learning curve. Do I really want to spend that 15 minutes of my life giving it over to that guy? He's talking about driving and being mad at a driver. You ever notice how when you get mad at a driver, how you carry that anger to the place you're going? There's that. Consider what you've left unresolved. Again, going back to that rugs thing. It's a healthy practice. And the hospice doctor says here, I had a 17-year-old who was dying of advanced liver cancer. She wanted to see whales before she died, and we were able to do that. But we're not able to do that unless we can articulate that. And that's one of the things that end-of-life doulas do is offer those conversations. So now I'm going to switch gears a little because there is a difference between what Stephen ministers get to do and what end-of-life doulas get to do. First, going to tell you a little bit about my story. I retired in 23. Methodists, we're a lot like Presbyterians, except maybe the trespasses, debts thing. But we're so methodical in the Methodist Church. July 1st, everyone stays in the same pulpit, goes on family leave. Everything changes on July 1st. You have a new appointment, you stay in your appointment, you take a leave, whatever it is. So if you retire, it's going to be July 1st. So July 1st, 2023. And I realized I still had a lot of energy and a passion to serve, and I wanted to listen my way into it and not just be busy. So I did the St. Ignatian exercises for a 9-month. I can highly recommend that. It was up at San Damiano. They offer it every year. I'm just putting in a plug for that. And I I listened my way into it, and then in April, my husband and I love doing biking trips together, and we were biking in Ireland. And I sat down for the dinner with all the fellow bikers, and I was talking to a woman next to me, and we just hit it off right away, and we went and went and went, and finally dessert came, and she turned to me and she said, "Kim, you should be an end-of-life doula." And new term for me, wasn't familiar, but you know those moments when someone says something, the light bulb goes on? I thought, yes, I should. So I learned more about it and took a training. So this is the first thing I would notice. When you get online and look at end-of-life doulas in the East Bay or Lafayette or Orinda, you want to make sure, I would say, that doula for yourself, a loved one, a care receiver, is trained. The practice of being an end-of-life doula has existed throughout time, but I think there are some guardrails that come with training that have to do with ethics, that have to do with approach, being clear about your purpose and what you're about. So I don't know if any of you have had a spiritual director. I think that career, that calling, re-emerged in the last several decades. And again, people just hung out a shingle with good intentions. I think the practice of being an end-of-life doula is kind of in that same spasm as when spiritual direction was several decades ago. It's just beginning to get traction. And I think you want to make sure that person is trained. There's some national organizations. There's some private trainings you can do. I went with NELDA, the International End-of-Life Doula Association. There's also NELDA, National End-of-Life Doula Association. That's one thing I would be aware of on that. And the goal that we have as end-of-life doulas, it's a fascinating training. Oh my gosh, it was just, one of the best. And you know, as a pastor, you keep doing trainings. This was like, hands down, one of the best things I ever did. And we emerged from that training clear of several priorities. One is to normalize discussions of death and dying and change that taboo. So that's one of the ways I do this, is these public presentations. Another way you can continue to do it, now don't cringe when I say this, the term might not set well, so just hang with it and I'll tell you more about it. It's called death cafes.
Death what?
Cafes. It's not whatever, let me tell you what it is. It's a gathering, it's not a grief support group. You gather and you can go to them online or in person. My first one I went to was in Piedmont at a yoga studio. They're usually in public settings. It was a gathering, an eclectic gathering of people. And there's no set agenda. There's often cake. I don't know how that goes. This is a Swedish practice, and we just imported it with the cake thing going. So there's often cake. It's a dedicated space for people to kind of take the initiative and bring their thoughts and yearnings about death. Again, it's not a grief group. The conversations are organic. The only thing is required is there is no agenda and the cake. And it's a little different in each setting. I'm sorry, it wasn't in Sweden. It started in Switzerland, and now it happens all over the world. If you're at all curious, I can highly recommend it. It was such a powerful connection to other human beings, and the conversation went deep quickly. It was an hour out of my life that I would repeat because I find them so meaningful. And you can search online for local ones.
What was the term again?
It's Death Cafe. Oh, good idea. Death Cafe. And if, as a Stephen minister, you're looking for ways to be more comfortable with this discussion, that's a good entry point as well. You've probably heard of birth doulas. They show up and companion for a longer period of time than other people might be there. So does an end-of-life doula. They're often called death doulas. I think that might have a PR problem, so I've gone with end-of-life. doulas. And in general, so part of our priorities, the first priority is normalizing this discussion, looking for opportunities to tap down the anxiety and resistance. And the other one is to advocate for the person who is your client. You are the person that is there for sometimes days, usually days, weeks, months, but you are listening and asking questions about what's important to them. Some of the things that you learn just tap down their anxiety. Like one woman I sat with, we got talking, she was a regular churchgoer, and yet as we talked about the end of life, she realized with uttermost clarity, there's no way she wanted a church service, which no one in her family would have known because she's in church, or was until having to be at home and then at a hospice residence. That would not have been easily known. But in the listening, in the meeting, and then to be an advocate for that, they came up with something that was just perfect for her. She and her husband had been married for 60 years. And even he didn't know her preference on this. What they did instead is after she passed, they had small gatherings, 5 or 6 people for different groups, people that had been with her those last months, their pickleball group, their neighbors, all the different ways they'd been connected to community, and just small groups sat in the living room with the husband and told stories. Perfect. And it was one of those goosebumpy moments where we listened ourselves into awareness of what we were honoring, what she wanted. Sometimes the work that End-of-Life Doula does are really specific. Legacy projects we work on if we have the time and the space to do that, if we're connected early enough. What they want to maybe leave for grandchildren and loved ones or whatever it is. And those are all, I'm going to do another ongoing education about legacy projects this coming week with Anelda. Often it's about specifics as they near that time when they know their body is ready to, they're not going to, this is a temporary shell and they know their body is shutting down. Do they want people to rub lotion on their hands? People have strong opinions about that. But if you don't ask, no one will tell. And do they want music in the background? And again, people usually have immediate preferences. So one of the questions for you to take home for your own self and your loved ones, and maybe conversations you have, is what does your ideal death look like? It's sort of like a birth plan for, the percentage of birth plans that really happen according to plan are very small. Often when a mother or family is expecting, they get to write down their ideal birth plan. And my point there was that those rarely go according to, how many people come on their due date, for one thing. And the mom might have a clear sense of how she wants things to go. And same with end-of-life plans. There's something valuable in articulating it, and just as important to hold it lightly. We can't guarantee that will happen. But candles, lotion, music. One woman knew for sure she wanted her bed by the window because we've decided that the trees and the backyard flowers, those were her holy scriptures. That's what we began to call them. But those kind of conversations come with that deep self-listening, the why am I talking, and it empowers the person who is dying. And that's worth so much more than we can guess. I'm trying to think. The stories I can tell are limited because the nature of the relationship and the confidentiality. But a question I often ask in starting any visit is what's important right now? And it shifts and changes, but again, it gives the person who is dying not control so much as a voice. And they're not just dying, they are involved.
Do you feel in that situation that you described at the beginning of your talk about that man you were sitting with, if you hadn't been his advocate for him saying all those things to his family, I mean, do you think your being his advocate facilitated those conversations if you had not been there?
Yeah, I've wondered about that. Of course, I don't know. I hope they would have happened, but I'm intentional about creating those moments. And I think of End-of-Life Doula is always thinking, how might we ask what's most important and listen our way into helping to make that happen. Are there questions?
How do people find an end-of-life doula?
We have this thing called Google now. And you can just put end-of-life or death doula in the search bar, and you'll find quite a few around here. That would.
Do individual people pop up, or is there a little group? And
Yes. First, people will come up because a lot of end-of-life doulas have their own business and Facebook page and all of that, so they're savvy in setting that up.
How do you deal with a situation where the patient has considerable dementia? How does that enter you?
How is it when you're serving as an end-of-life doula when dementia is one of the realities of that relationship? The person who is your client is in some phase of dementia. It's a showing up bit by bit, showing up each time to see what's possible, I guess, is you kind of, there's no way to plan or guess what that day is going to be like, or that visit's going to be like, which is true across the board for someone who is in hospice or dying or with dementia. And sometimes it's just trusting my intuition, which is another form of prayer, as to how to sit with them. I had mentioned, and what your question reminded me of, the priorities you come out of end-of-life doula training with is to normalize the discussion, to be a faithful advocate for the person dying, but also to be attentive to the circle of care. I spend a lot of time with the family. I might visit with someone and then spend time with the family. And in that way, sometimes that's even more important when there's dementia, because you can imagine how much they want to help and how frustrating it can be to try to understand what's needed. I don't want to run away from your question. I'm saying there's probably no formula, but it's showing up and caring and wanting to offer the same thing to that person that you would to anyone else. And because I'm not family, I have deeper reserves of patience and attentiveness, perhaps, on a good day that I can offer.
How do you interact with family members who don't want to allow that their loved one is going to die?
You asked a key question there. How is it? The circle of care? I remember one gentleman. His wife was only like 40 years old. They were young. They had little kids, and we could not mention death or dying. So it was a balance between honoring that request, being curious about that request, and how do I show up with integrity, kind of braiding all of those three together. Again, no formula, and it happens. It's like we think if we say that person is dying, we have the power to make them die. I think that's one of the latent fears.
What impact does it have on the dying person when their loved ones refuse to allow them to die?
Yes, it's one of the biggest aches. What impact does it have when their loved ones refuse to acknowledge? And often the medical, I have so much respect for all the medical people in my life and care, but often, as the article was by Sarah Wildman, the medical practice is to look at death as a failure. So they kind of aid and abet that conversation. And yet, most time, if the person is still responsive and able to have a conversation, I can't tell you the relief it brings. and I see our pastor nodding over there, the relief it brings when that person can say, I'm dying. And often there's tears when they get to say that.
What's generally the timing of when a death doula is engaged?
Great question. There is no answer in that it's all over the board. There are physiological signs up to 3 months before that a person, that's part of the training that you do. And sometimes we're invited in or asked in when they start hospice, which could be 6 months with renewals options in there. Often it's later, and it's at least a couple, all of mine have been a couple of weeks or months.
What do you, just to follow up, what do you feel in your own experience is an ideal time, or is there one?
I'm going to say no, not an ideal time. It has to be a yes from the client. You can't assign someone that doesn't want.
It's like Stephen Ministry, we only go.
Yes. I was just, yes, thank you. Yes, yes.
In your experience, has an individual requested you as an end-of-life doula?
Who usually contacts me? Is it a family member or the person dying? And it's kind of a mix and match. I don't know. I don't, off the top of my head, I would say it's both. Well, I know it's both. And if it's just the family member, that discussion has to be had with the dying person. I'm happy to facilitate that, but it's not something you can impose or require.
Can you give me an example of how you would facilitate that conversation between the family and the dying person? What kinds of things would you ask? What would that meeting look like?
What would that meeting look like if I was facilitating a discussion between the family member who thought an end-of-life doula would be a good idea and the person who is dying? Again, there's not a formula. You go in full self-listening. Why is the family member so insistent? Why, I'm kind of curious. Why is the dying person thinking not a good idea? And it turns out if you've been a pastor for 20 years, often people ask me to be their end-of-life doula because they know me in a different scenario. And so I already have a little bit of connection, which makes that I can draw on other things that I know about them. So I don't know if that's cheating, but it's often part of it. Mainly it's that full self-listening and trusting that I will be, if I listen carefully in stereo to my creator, that intuition, the people in front of me, that we will navigate that discussion, whether I know them or not, before then, and each one is different.
So ideally, is an end-of-life doula an advocate for specifically the dying person or also for their family?
Both, yes. My primary allegiance is to the dying person, to represent their views, and some things that I have permission to share with the family members, some ones I don't. So there's that as well, to be clear about what they don't, but they just want to tell me because I don't want to disturb the family. So going forward, you can continue to ponder, just be curious, what have I internalized about death and dying? What sort of things trigger anxiety around that for me? And again, it's just you want to do that gently with yourself, maybe have a companion to talk about with on that, to be aware of death doulas or end-of-life doulas. They are a great resource. You can tap into it by Googling them. There's some amazing ones in this area that are part of the community. Yeah, you can't go wrong. And again, I just want to earmark again that getting someone that's been trained, I think, is good because abuse could happen. I just want to name that you want someone that has done due diligence, is certified, and is part of that team.
Dying is not a get-out-of-debt-free card.
Right.
do you have resources for people that use your services to what they can expect from a financial standpoint?
I do this as my service because I connect with Hope Solutions and Open Heart Kitchen and other organizations. So my service, my commitment is with communities, but I don't charge because I want to be available to folks that are connected with Hope Solutions or Open Heart Kitchen that might never have, and it just was too cumbersome to try to have it do it. So I don't charge. Most do. You get the same quality of service. And that, I'm so glad you brought up that other part. What about other things you have to do to get your affairs in order? I provide resources. I don't do it for a client, but I have a checklist of things that you might want to be aware of. And I'm so glad. I need to add that to my talk as part of what doulas do. Because most people, especially if you're in hospice, they've already had that conversation. But I make sure, because you know that can be so painful if those things aren't attended to.
One of the things you haven't touched on is the Right to Die initiative.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak a little bit?
Yes, it's medically assisted aid in dying is what it's called here, and I'm comfortable with that. I've walked alongside. There's another one in San Francisco called Final Exit, which I have a cautionary tale about that because it's not legal, their version. But medically assisted aid in dying can be done in hospice care. It can be done, and there are legal standards of how many times a doctor you have to be in touch with a doctor, 2 different doctors at 2 different times. There's a process for that. And there's also where your voluntary cessation of eating and drinking. Some people choose that. I'm comfortable with that.
Stephen Ministry training is faith-based. Is the training for end-of-life faith-based?
No, it's probably a little more economical in that sense. Most of the doulas will identify all over the agnostic, spiritual, not religious, yet they've all had an inkling of something bigger than themselves. So I'm curious about how when I ask people how they got into it, is because they experience something sacred, even if they don't use that word. So it's usually because they feel called, again, kind of a churchy word, to that ministry because there's something sacred going on. So you can vet the end-of-life doula that's a right match for you. When someone that I'm meeting with wants no mention of a higher, supreme, loving being, I honor that. That doesn't mean I'm not informed and leaning into that. Both can happen.
What is the range of price of it?
Wow. What is the range of prices for a doula? I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that completely, but some people do packages, like you pay one set fee. Some people do hourly. I would say in a $500 ballpark figure, maybe.
How long is your typical service that you provide?
Sometimes it's months. Mine have all been months or weeks. I also offer vigil, where if that person doesn't want to be alone and there's not family, sometimes that's intense near the end because I want to honor that. And hospice honors that too. They have people that will offer vigil.
I was just wondering if you have provided service for folks who are simply declining in health.
Yeah. Yes, I find that as rewarding as any other way of doing it because I'm the person that can kind of open the conversation about death and dying and grieving and having your affairs in order, and that's appropriate at any stage.
How long is the training? Is it full-time, college-type training?
Yeah.
Evening or online?
And again, that varies a little bit in terms of which organization you go with. There's one called Going with Grace. It's a private one. There's NELDA and INNELDA, 2 different national and international organizations. And My training was online, 4 hours a shot for I think 4 weeks, twice a week. But then there's, like, the student ministers do this continuing ed. Every month, Inelda offers me, and like there was one on if you want to get insurance for your business as an end-of-life doula, or there's community building ones. I'm going one on legacy projects this coming week. There's meetups around. So while you do the initial training, you can do it in person, intense, extended. It's packaged all different ways. I think it's the continuing ed that's just as important. It might be a question to ask if you're going to hire or connect with the doula. Since the training, what else have you participated in for both? Like with you all that are Stephen ministers, it's support, it's accountability, and it's ongoing education.
Maybe this is a silly question, but I've never heard the word doula. What does that mean?
It's a word, I think, from the Greek originally. It is, thanks. Yeah, it's a caring relationship to help, support, encourage, but it also comes with an extra dollop of skill that you are trained. If you're a birth doula, you're trained about the birthing process and when to call for help and when, what medical needs might need immediate attention. Same with the end-of-life doula. A lot on doing that internal work of what do I bring to it, and a lot about the physiology of death so you can help the family and the dying person. A lot about how to advocate, as someone over here mentioned, when the family is all over the place in terms of how they're approaching it. It's a wonderful, I'm biased. I think Stephen ministers are some of the most wonderful people on earth. I think end-of-life doulas extend that and deepen that. Can I end with a story that celebrates who you are? This is a story that is told in the Buddhist tradition. It's a fable, but it reminds me about what you do and what you bring and the divine that resides in you. There was a musk deer, so a wild animal, who very early in her life noticed a heavenly scent in the air. It was a divine aroma, and she set out her life goal to find that source. She searched the depths of every forest. She smelled around every tree, every blade of grass. But where was this scent, this something divine that was real? Where was that coming from? She remained determined. She climbed mountains and forged gorges, and she spent her life searching for this divine reality that she knew existed because she'd smelled it. She knew it was somewhere. Finally, she fell exhausted on the forest floor, and as she fell, one of her horns pierced her own belly. Suddenly, the air was filled with this divine heavenly scent. And after a lifetime of searching, in the final moments of her precious life, she realized the scent was coming from her, dwelled within her all along. So however you go into the afternoon and evening and week ahead, you have that divine presence that is the definition of who you are. And however you bring that into the world, it will make a difference. And I'm grateful for that. Amen.